This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so imagine a nation so scarred by war that it just vows to never get involved again.
Right.
But then, like just 2 decades later, they find themselves right back on the front lines of another global conflict.
Yeah.
And that is exactly the story we're diving into today. How the U.S. went from, staunch isolationism to being fully involved in World War II.
Yeah, such a fascinating period. So many twists and turns. Deeply held beliefs were challenged by how fast the world was changing.
Absolutely. So we're going deep with a podcast episode called The U.S. Response to European Events After 1933, From Isolationism to Engagement. And it's from Mr. Hutchings History, which is the series aimed at IBDP history students. So we know
we're in for a treat.
we're gonna learn something today, that's for sure.
That's definitely.
And this deep dive will take us through all this major historical interpretations of this period.
Yes, exactly.
From traditionalists to revisionists, and we'll really examine how they approach this pivotal shift in American foreign policy.
It's going to be good.
So let's rewind all the way back to the aftermath of World War I. The U.S. emerged from that conflict with a super strong sense of isolationism.
Right.
Why? Why was that?
Well, think about it. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war, left a lot of Americans just disillusioned.
Yeah.
They looked at it and they were like, this was a costly mistake.
Yeah.
A European affair that the U.S. got dragged into, and for what, And the traditionalist historian Charles Beard argued that U.S. involvement in these foreign wars, it only served the interests of, these capitalist elites, not the everyday person.
Right. So it's like this feeling of like we shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Right.
And that was just like amplified even more by all the economic hardship
Exactly.
of the Great Depression.
Exactly. So the focus really shifted inward. People were just trying to survive.
Yeah.
Jobs were scarce, putting food on the table, like foreign policy that seemed like a world away, you know? So you can really see how all of this domestic turmoil fueled this desire to just stay out of it, stay out of anything international.
Stay away, yeah.
Yeah.
And so we have this backdrop of isolationism, and then, bam, Franklin D. Roosevelt takes office in 1933.
So what was his approach to foreign policy like, given all of that?
Well, Roosevelt himself was much more inclined towards international engagement.
Yeah.
But he was facing a Congress and also just the public that was deeply wary of, foreign entanglements.
Right.
So consensus historians like William Lichtenberg, they argue that Roosevelt's foreign policy was shaped more by, these pragmatic constraints than his own desires.
Interesting. And the podcast episode even mentions that his New Deal, those series of domestic programs to tackle the Depression, like that dominated his early presidency.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he had to prioritize domestic recovery.
Right. But it's also important to note that, the New Deal itself was a radical departure from any previous economic policies, and some historians see it as like the groundwork for a more active role for the U.S. government on the world stage, So it's a very complex picture.
It is, yeah. So this is where the Neutrality Acts of the mid-1930s come in, right?
Precisely. These acts, they were attempts to, legislate isolationism.
Interesting.
Yeah. They reflect the anxieties of the time, and they restricted the U.S. from getting involved in these foreign conflicts by saying no to things like, selling arms or traveling on ships of countries that were at war.
Got it. So it sounds like these acts were like a direct response to that prevailing isolationist sentiment, but did they actually even achieve their goals?
Well, that's a question that historians debate,
Okay.
Some people think that the Neutrality Acts actually made things even worse because they emboldened these aggressors like Hitler and Mussolini, who looked at America's inaction and were like, green light, let's go, So they went after their expansionist ambitions.
Interesting. And for a lot of Americans, especially those in rural and Midwestern America, isolationism was more than just a policy. It was like a way of life.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, geographic distance definitely played a role.
Yeah.
But there was also this historical distrust of European politics. I mean, just imagine growing up hearing stories about the horrors of World War I, the trenches, all this senseless death, the pandemic after. It's no wonder people wanted to stay out of it,
Totally, yeah. And the episode highlights the powerful impact of Hollywood films, like All Quiet on the Western Front,
Oh, yeah.
which really vividly depicted the brutality of war. I mean, I can only imagine
Oh,
how
yeah.
it's
They had a
taken.
profound effect on public opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
Really did. And then you have the America First Committee, this powerful isolationist organization. They advocated for just focusing on, national defense and avoiding those foreign wars.
Yeah. And speaking of the America First Committee, figures like Charles Lindbergh, who was a national hero at the time, became like prominent voices within that movement.
Yeah. But it's important to remember that Lindbergh wasn't just some blind isolationist.
Right.
I mean, he truly believed that America's involvement in World War I was a mistake, and he was passionate that the U.S. should focus on, building up its own defenses instead of getting tangled up in Europe's conflicts, and his arguments resonated with a lot of Americans.
For sure, yeah. So we have this strong current of isolationism, reinforced by legislation, popular culture, these influential figures.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have Roosevelt,
Mm-hmm.
who is seeing this storm gathering in Europe and Asia.
Yeah.
So how did he navigate that tension?
It was a delicate balancing act. He couldn't just, come out and challenge the isolationist sentiment, but he also knew that the threat posed by fascism was growing. So revisionist historians, people like Robert Dallek, they argue that, maybe Roosevelt could have been more forceful in opposing those Neutrality Acts and could have done more to get the U.S. ready for the possibility of war.
That's really interesting. And the episode mentions his struggle with those Neutrality Acts.
Yeah.
He understood the political reality,
He did.
but he was also super concerned about the rise of Nazi Germany.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also important to note that Roosevelt wasn't completely powerless.
Right.
He skillfully maneuvered within those constraints of the Neutrality Acts. So, for example, after Germany invades Poland in 1939, he actually convinces Congress to allow the sale of arms to, those warring nations as long as it was cash and carry.
So even while, maintaining a semblance of neutrality,
Right.
he was finding these ways to aid those who were, actually fighting against fascist aggression.
Exactly.
So this was a pretty significant step away from, strict neutrality, wasn't it?
It was, but he was strategic about it, making sure the public was on board. He knew he couldn't get too far ahead of public opinion.
Right. And this brings us to the Munich Crisis of 1938, where Britain and France tried to appease Hitler by letting him just annex the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, and this event is, a lot of times, seen through the lens of the Orthodox school of thought. They think that the Munich Agreement was just a failed policy of appeasement that only emboldened Hitler and made war, inevitable.
And Roosevelt had private doubts about appeasement too, right?
He did, yeah. He recognized that giving in to Hitler's demands was really dangerous.
Yeah.
But again, he also had to think about the fact that most Americans just wanted to stay out of European conflicts.
Right. So he's kind of finding himself once again in this position where, what he personally believes is clashing with, this prevailing sentiment in the country.
Absolutely. And this tension would just keep playing out in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor and would ultimately shape America's destiny and its role on the world stage,
It's wild.
It's a big one.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, right? Roosevelt trying to kind of, nudge public opinion towards, a more interventionist stance. He knew he couldn't force a change in policy. He had to bring the American people along with him.
Yeah. That's a really key insight into his leadership. He was a master communicator.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, the podcast episode talks about his quarantine speech in 1937.
Yeah.
Where he uses this really powerful analogy talking about isolating these aggressor nations like a disease,
Yeah, yeah. What's interesting to me is that, this speech, while not immediately successful, it was an early attempt to shift public opinion towards collective security. Did he face a lot of, pushback for that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, people were divided.
Yeah.
Some thought it was absolutely necessary to counter this growing threat of fascism, and others were like, Roosevelt, you're a warmonger.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine, all these debates happening in newspapers and, living rooms across the country.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It really highlights, those deep divisions within American society at the time. On the one hand, we have this desire to stay out of these conflicts. Right. But on the other hand, there's this growing recognition that, the rise of fascism is, a serious threat to global peace and security.
It's complex, right? There's no easy answers.
Yeah.
And while the initial response to that speech was mostly negative, it did plant a seed, I think.
Yeah.
It challenged the idea that America could stay completely isolated
Right.
from what was going on.
From the rest of the world.
Exactly.
Yeah. And while, like, trying to shift public opinion at home, Roosevelt's also taking a stand against Japanese aggression in China.
Yeah, and he does this mainly through economic measures, sanctions and things like that.
Okay.
And the podcast specifically mentions the oil embargo on Japan in 1940.
That must have had a significant impact on Japan. I mean, they were heavily reliant on foreign oil.
Oh, absolutely. And, a lot of historians think this economic pressure was a major factor in their decision to
attack Pearl Harbor?
To attack Pearl Harbor, yeah.
Wow.
In 1941.
So he's like trying to contain aggression abroad, but also navigate like this really strong isolationist sentiment at home. It's such a tightrope walk.
Total tightrope walk.
Yeah.
Yeah. It reminds me of some of the foreign policy debates we see today.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
that question of like, how far should a nation go to like defend their interests
Right.
and values when facing, a rising threat?
Yeah. It resonates today.
Absolutely. And this takes us to a pivotal moment, the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941.
Mm-hmm.
This was a major turning point, right?
Oh, huge.
Okay.
Yeah. Lend-Lease allowed the U.S. to provide, arms and supplies to Britain and the other allies without demanding immediate payment.
Wow.
It was a big move, really challenging the spirit of those Neutrality Acts.
Yeah. And the podcast host mentions this memorable analogy
Oh, yeah.
that Roosevelt used
The garden hose.
for Lend-Lease, yeah. Like lending your neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire.
It's such a good one.
Yeah, it's simple, but it's like, it's a powerful image that I think probably resonated
Oh, absolutely.
with people.
Brilliant, It frames it as helping a friend in need
Yeah.
rather than getting tangled up in a conflict that's far away.
Yeah, yeah.
It's I think, a great example of Roosevelt using his communication skills to, build support for his policy.
He had a knack for explaining these like super complex foreign policy ideas
He did, yeah.
in a way that people could understand.
Yep. And Lend-Lease, I think, really marked a shift in
Yeah.
U.S. policy. It was like, hey, world, America's not sitting on the sidelines anymore.
Yeah, yeah. But even with Lend-Lease, like the U.S. is still not officially at war.
That's true, but then
Oh.
the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, I mean, that changes everything. It's really hard to overstate the impact of that.
Oh my gosh, yeah. It was like a devastating surprise attack.
Yep.
That unified American public opinion, like I don't think
Right.
anything else could have.
It's true.
It led to that U.S. declaration of war on Japan and basically ended American isolationism.
Yeah, and then shortly after, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., so, America was fully in...
Fully in the conflict. Wow. It's like amazing to think about, the journey we've just like traced from like the depths of isolationism to like this sudden like eruption of war.
It really shows how, like, history is rarely neat and tidy, right? It's full of contradictions and, like, all these unexpected turns.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that even like the most, deeply held beliefs and policies can just be like transformed by events.
Yeah, sometimes it takes something catastrophic, like
Right.
Pearl Harbor, to just shatter these assumptions that we've had for so long and push a nation on a whole new course.
Yeah. And it's also a testament to like this complex interplay between, domestic politics,
Yeah.
public opinion, and international events.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, would the U.S. have eventually entered the war even without Pearl Harbor?
It's a good question.
Like, was that event like the catalyst that like changed everything?
Yeah.
It's incredible, to think about this whole journey we've just traced from like the scars of World War I, the Great Depression, and then the rise of fascism and this constant back and forth between isolationism and interventionism to finally that devastating attack on Pearl Harbor.
It is.
It makes you realize how interconnected all of these historical events really are.
It does, yeah. And it reminds us that, history isn't just about, like, facts and dates on a timeline,
Yeah.
but, like, a whole tapestry of human experiences, decisions, and consequences,
Yeah. What are some of the like key takeaways that stand out to you from this deep dive?
I think one of the biggest things is, like, how much public sentiment actually affects foreign policy decisions. We saw how Roosevelt, even with his personal beliefs, he still had to deal with this deeply ingrained isolationist feeling in the country.
Yeah.
He had to, like, persuade, cajole, even kind of work around public opinion just to steer the nation towards, more global engagement.
That's so true. Like, it really makes you think, how different things could have been if, like, public opinion had been more on board with Roosevelt's views
Totally. Yeah.
from the get-go,
Yeah, absolutely. It also makes you realize, how important leadership and communication are, especially during a crisis.
Yeah.
Roosevelt was so good at connecting with people
Yeah.
and explaining these really complicated issues in
Yeah.
a way that everyone could understand that was huge and shaping public opinion and ultimately, U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah. And it's also really striking how, like, the economic factors played such a huge role
Right.
in shaping the U.S. response to, like, these global events.
Oh, for sure. The Great Depression, it created such an inward focus for the country. And it made it even harder to, like, get people to care about intervention abroad.
Right.
Imagine trying to tell someone who's, like, struggling to put food on the table, hey, worry about what's happening on the other side of the world,
It makes sense. And yet, despite all of these internal struggles, the rise of fascism, it eventually forced the U.S. to confront its, like, global responsibilities.
It did.
It's like a reminder that sometimes these events that are completely out of our control,
Yeah.
they can force us to, like, reevaluate what matters,
Absolutely.
and our place in the world.
For sure. The threat from, like, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, it just became impossible to ignore. And it, like, challenged the very core of, democracy and freedom.
Yeah.
And, that's what made the U.S. abandon that isolationist idea and actually take a stand. And by doing that, they, like, helped shape the entire course of the 20th century and beyond.
Wow. And that stand, like, solidified by Pearl Harbor, that was a turning point, not just for the U.S., but for the whole world.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the U.S. came out of World War II as, like, a global superpower.
Yeah.
And played a leading role in shaping the world after the war.
Right.
And that legacy, it still impacts us today.
Right.
Both in how the U.S. acts on the world stage and also just in how we debate, its role in global affairs.
It's amazing to think that, decisions made way back then are still having consequences.
Yeah.
Today.
Yeah.
This deep dive has given me such a new perspective on American history and just its, like, worldwide impact.
And, the thing is, a lot of those questions that came up back then, they're still relevant now,
Yeah.
Like, how do you balance what a nation wants with what's good for the whole world? When is it okay to intervene and what are the risks,
Yeah.
There's no easy answers, but understanding, like, the historical background, I think that can help us look at these really complicated issues, in a smarter, more nuanced way.
Yeah, you've given us a lot to think about. As we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to the question, what lessons can we actually learn from this period of American history? And, like, how does that help us understand the U.S. role in the world today? It's definitely something worth thinking about, and that's what the deep dive is all about, encouraging you to explore, question, and keep learning. So until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.